broad national survey that my colleagues and I conducted to understand the public's perspectives on marijuana, teen use, legalization, and policies aimed at safeguarding young people in the context of state marijuana legalization. So whether or not one favors legalization, I know we do not, we do assume that if marijuana is legalized in their state, most adults would want the law to have protections for minors from exposure to, access to, and use of the drug. But we also know that our assumptions aren't always right, and it's the facts about where their constituents stand on these issues that might actually hold some sway for policymakers who are working on the specific regulations that accompany state marijuana laws. So policymakers' attention has been focused primarily on satisfying the loud calls in most states for liberalizing marijuana laws. And we need to refocus that attention on protecting kids as much as possible. We hope that arming them, policymakers, legislators, with some data about the public's support for regulations to effectively protect minors, if that support actually does exist, might help produce some more sensible provisions in the laws in the states that have or do end up legalizing marijuana. And if the public support for youth protection provisions isn't as strong as we hope it would be, the findings from the survey can hopefully help us target our public education efforts to boost that support and influence policymakers to do the right thing. So I wish I could share more of the findings from the survey today, but I just have a few minutes with you, so I want to highlight some of the interesting things that have emerged, especially with respect to findings that can help guide our public education efforts and our efforts to advocate for strong youth protection with policymakers. So, real quick, let's just get into it. About 2 years ago, we conducted a nationally representative survey of a little over 1,500 registered voters. We focused on registered voters so that the findings would be most relevant to elected officials who presumably would care what their voting constituents think about these issues. And we deliberately ensured that half the sample would be of parents with minor children under the age of 21, and then half would be of adults who do not have children under the age of 21, so that we have that sort of equal representation of both groups. That was assuming that there would be very significant differences in how parents versus non-parents view these issues, which I'll share with you soon was a little surprising. That's not the case. There's a lot of data on the next few slides. They only represent a fraction of the items in this pretty large survey, but in the interest of time, I'm going to try to put your attention to those findings that I think are most important for strategizing how to approach this issue with the public and with policymakers. So really quickly, here are some of the key demographic breakdowns. I'm sure I could have presented this in a nicer way, but there was very decent representation of the various demographic groups and is a nationally representative survey. But I want to put your attention to the last bullet where we did ask respondents about their current marijuana use, assuming that that would be relevant to their views about legalization and relevant restrictions on access and use that would protect kids, but also potentially affect their own access and use. And we found from other research that when you kind of try and put restrictions within the law that affect the adults' use and access, they're not as in favor of those youth protection provisions. So we wanted to kind of dive in a little deeper there. But I just want to note that we did only ask that question about, your own current marijuana use of respondents who were in states where the law where marijuana is legal, and only of individuals ages 21 and older, because we didn't want to get into asking people to admit to illegal behavior within this particular survey. We can do that in surveys sometimes, but that wasn't our main goal here. So this is the next few slides. You'll also see that several of the questions about the attitudes and preferences related to marijuana regulation are presented in comparison to alcohol and tobacco regulation. And this is because the regulation of these substances is typically and reasonably used as a framework or benchmark for many states' decision-making around how strict marijuana regulations should be if they are going to go ahead and legalize the drug. And here we see that the public generally is most familiar with and supportive of their state's alcohol regulations, which are the orange bars, support for and familiarity for tobacco laws, the gray bars come behind that, and marijuana and purple is behind those two. So it's not insignificant, but the least familiarity and the least support. But what I really want to direct your attention to is the set of bars all the way to the right, which show that only about 1 in 4 adults who were surveyed think that these laws, whether for alcohol, tobacco, or marijuana, are sufficiently effective in protecting young people. So that is a really important opportunity for us. And we can and will analyze these findings by a variety of demographic and attitudinal variables that we have in the survey. But these are the overall findings across the whole sample, including individuals in states that have legalized marijuana and in states that have not. So here we broke the marijuana bars down a little bit so that we can represent those in states that have legalized, which are the purple bars, and those that have not, which are the yellow bars. And we asked respondents whether they think that their own state's laws and regulations are too strict, too loose, or just right for each of the substances, tobacco, alcohol, marijuana. And not surprisingly, we see that respondents in states that have not legalized marijuana, the yellow bars, think their state's laws are too strict when it comes to marijuana. But what's interesting is really the states where marijuana has been legalized, which are the purple bars, and their public satisfaction with the strictness of those laws and regulations are kind of all over the place, with under half thinking that they're just right in terms of how strict they are, and it's quite a bit fewer than those who are satisfied with the strictness of their tobacco and alcohol laws in their states. And to me, that is an important opening for us to affect some change. We have there's not a strong consensus there on how people are feeling about whether their marijuana laws are strict enough or not. But here's more encouragement for advocating for more strict policies when it comes to marijuana. When asked specifically how strict they believe the regulations should be on marijuana advertising, promotion, packaging, and sale, we see significant consensus among respondents both in states that have legalized the drug and those that have not, that these regulations should be strict. So framing the strict question, not in sort of an abstract way, but really specifically calling out the advertising, the promotion, the sale, manufacture, locations of sale, locations of use, that seems to garner more widespread support, regardless of the state's current legalization status. Just a little bit more on perceptions of how strict these laws should be. We did want to sort of frame measures of their preferred strictness of marijuana laws and regulations in comparison to tobacco and alcohol. And the findings here suggest that the public generally looks to alcohol as the right model, which also reveals a really good opportunity for public education. Because as the prior speakers have talked about, and as many of us know, researchers, public health professionals largely believe that tobacco regulations are the better model for marijuana when it comes to protecting kids especially. They're more restrictive and they're more effective in curbing youth use. So I hear this all the time, they're like, well, we need to do, set up the regulations the way alcohol regulations are set up if we want to protect young people. We need to kind of shift that narrative to direct people more towards tobacco. We do a better job there over the years, and that's where we want to be looking. This is a busy, ugly slide, I'm sorry, but there are a lot of interesting demographic differences in how the public views these issues. I'll touch briefly on those, which are the ones in orange that came out to be statistically significant in our larger model of this analysis. But generally across the board, the majority indicated that they prefer strict regulation, so that's at 77% above all those bars in the total sample. It was a little higher in legalized states. But in terms of demographic differences, not too surprisingly, I think, females are slightly more in favor of strict regulations around marijuana than are males. White respondents and those identifying with other ethnicities or races, more so than black respondents. Republicans, more so than independents and Democrats, and those who don't use marijuana, more so than those who do. But the counterintuitive finding that was surprising to me that I want to point out is that fourth column, which is looking at parents of minors versus those who are, they may be parents, but they don't have minor children, or they do not have any children. We find that those who were not parents of minors consistently voiced more support for strict regulations than those who were parents of minors. And I kept thinking that was wrong. We tried every which way to look at this data and try to understand it, and we saw, check if it was a function of age, if it was a function of their own marijuana use, thinking maybe younger people who are more likely to have younger kids are also more without being there. So the assumption that parents are necessarily more on board than non-parents with strict regulations, which was my assumption, does not seem to be borne out necessarily, but at least our data. So that's another point to keep in mind as we conduct public education and outreach efforts. We don't want to go on these assumptions that we know who's in support and who's not, because it's not always the way it seems. Here are some specific data that look at public's attitudes about legalization, concerns about teen marijuana use, and opinions about what policymakers should do about it. So when asked in more detail about specific consequences of teen use, we see in the bars on the left side that attitudes are pretty widespread in terms of, there's pretty widespread concern that teen marijuana use can lead to health or academic consequences, crime or impaired driving, and slightly less so addiction and other substance use. So that's good, because that is what the data shows. Our prior speaker had talked about from all those really amazing literature reviews or scoping reviews. On the right bars, we see that 2/3 of the respondents agree that policymakers should impose strict regulations specifically to protect teens, and about 3 in 5 agree that legalization will lead to a rise in teen use. But looking at that top of the slide, only about half are actually concerned about the rise in teen use. So I know it's a little confusing and it's sort of all over the place. It depends on how the question was asked. But what it tells me is that we have some decent public awareness of the potential harmful consequences of teen marijuana use, but not as much awareness or concern that legalization might play a role in youth marijuana use and those adverse consequences that people say they are concerned about. So again, real good opportunities for public education and awareness. We turn to attitudes more specifically, and looking at which attitudes relate to a preference for strict regulations around marijuana. Not surprisingly, we see that people who agree that state legalization will lead to an increase in use, or those who are concerned about teen use leading to things like crime, impaired driving, academic problems, health problems, they have stronger preference for strict regulations. But what it does suggest that across demographic differences, attitudes and perceptions about marijuana being harmful to teens and about legalization increasing that risk do contribute to public support for strict regulation. Again, highlighting the importance of public education here. So I'm getting warnings, but I have just a little bit more. I just want to kind of break this down. I know it's a lot. So my key takeaways here are that there are significant and mostly predictable demographic differences in attitudes about marijuana legalization and what to do about it. The public isn't particularly familiar or supportive of their current state's marijuana laws and regulations, especially in terms of how they relate to protecting kids, and especially in terms of how much they support it relative to tobacco and alcohol laws. And they don't think they're particularly effective in protecting kids. So there's a lot of room for education here. And while there are these important demographic differences, we can't really do much about people's demographic characteristics. What we can do a lot about are their attitudes and perceptions and understanding of these issues, and that's where public education, again, comes into play. So we really want to invest in that public education to ensure that adults' attitudes and beliefs reflect the evidence around marijuana, young people, and legalization, and to leverage public support to influence policies around protecting kids in the context of legalization. And these data clearly show that those who are concerned about those effects are in support of more strict regulations to protect kids. We can't stop with the public. We have to educate policymakers that the majority of the voting public, about 2/3 across the board, regardless of state legalization, do want strict regulations to protect young people from the drug. Finally, there's a lot more in this very rich data set that we're still exploring and hoping to publish, but in the meantime, I'd like to share with you or remind you, if you already know about it, that at Partnership to End Addiction, which is where I work, we have a really terrific report with research-based recommendations on policy provisions to protect youth in states that have or do choose to legalize marijuana, like the access here. And the recommendations largely conform with what has been talked about at the summit, as in terms of good ways to protect kids if the state is legalizing. It includes a comprehensive review of the literature of what works and what has worked for alcohol and tobacco, and what we know so far when it comes to marijuana and protecting kids. It presents a landscape review of existing state laws and regulations, in states that have legalized, has more of the data from the survey, and has really clear recommendations regarding packaging, advertising, marketing, pretty detailed if you're a policy wonk, for what you can literally do in your state if you are legal, if there is legalization, and what we can advocate for to include in those policies. And finally, we do have some state-specific reports for states that have legalized, of kind of what they have done versus what they should have done, and where those gaps are, and what we can do to kind of close those gaps and be on board and protecting kids. So thank you so much for all the work that you all do. Please use us as a resource for public education and influencing policy to the extent that we can help. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you.